This week, I'm going to be talking about the cardiovascular system, which consists of the heart and the blood vessels. So, this is one of the vital systems in the human body, and it's one of the ones that makes a very immediate difference if things aren't working with it. Like, whereas with your liver, for instance, if your liver were not doing so well, it could take a while for it to become noticeable. If your heart isn't doing well, there are some things about it that can go on for a long time without being noticed, but a lot of things that are very dramatic and immediate. So the cardiovascular system consists of the heart, which is the cardio part, and the blood vessels, which are the vascular part. It also contains the blood, which is a tissue also. Blood is liquid, but it contains cells of different sorts that work together. And so it is considered a type of tissue. And so the main goal of the cardiovascular system is to move nutrients and oxygen throughout the body. The red blood cells carry oxygen. They contain iron, which binds with oxygen and carries it to the other cells. And the plasma contains various other nutrients that are carried by it in liquid form to all reaches of the body. So that's some of the main stuff that it does. It also takes away waste products, which can get filtered out by the liver and kidneys. And it also contains a lot of different transports and contains a lot of different substances that the body uses for different purposes. So we tend to think of the heart as being sort of the main center of the cardiovascular system. It is the part that does the most moving, so it's the most noticeable part. And of course, it has kind of a cultural importance as an organ that we think of as being associated with the emotions, because your heart beats faster when you're excited and things like that. So really all organs are affected by the emotions and affect the emotions in turn, but with the heart, it's just very palpable and noticeable. So the heart gets a lot of special attention, although it's important to realize that other parts of the cardiovascular system are extremely vital as well. If the aorta, which is a large blood vessel, breaks, then you're dead just as quickly as if the heart stops working. So heart moves a lot of fluid all the time, beats constantly throughout your whole life, and eventually it gets worn out and stops being able to beat anymore. So that is a big part of a big determining factor of the life cycle of an individual person. And because of that, or another way to look at that is that heart disease and heart dysfunction is a leading cause of death and a leading determinant of lifespan. So the heart itself has 4 chambers, and I don't feel like it's necessary to go into all the details about that. There's plenty of information about that out there that you can look up if you're interested in the exact details of how blood moves through the heart. But the important part that I want everybody to realize is that the heart takes in blood that is brought to it by the veins, and it pumps the blood out through the arteries. The arteries carry the blood away from the heart to all the different parts of the body. And then it goes into very small tissues called capillaries. The word capilla means hair. So capillaries are hair-sized or smaller blood vessels that move all through the tissue, that permeate all through the tissue. And they connect from arteries to veins. So the arteries start out as very large arteries, branch into smaller and smaller and smaller arteries, arterioles, which are very small arteries, and then eventually to capillaries, which then connect them to veins, which drain into larger and larger veins until they get back to the heart. And there's also the pulmonary vein, which takes, well, when blood leaves the heart through the pulmonary artery, it goes to the lungs, gets oxygen through the tissue of the lungs, and comes back to the heart with oxygen in it through the pulmonary vein. And so that's part of the circulatory process. So there's a gas exchange happening between the blood and the tissue of the lungs. And so the that happens in the lungs and is responsible for getting rid of waste gases like carbon dioxide that are produced during metabolism and bringing in fresh oxygen, which is involved in cellular respiration, which is the process at a cellular level by which cells take in oxygen and use it to, in a chemical reaction, to release energy, to burn calories. So you actually have a process of caloric material being oxidated in a very similar way to the way that fuel is oxidated in a fire. It combines with oxygen, it releases heat, it releases energy. And so that's where all the energy in your body comes from, is an oxidation reaction. This is somewhat analogous to actual burning that goes on in cells, and that is cellular respiration. Structurally, there's some difference in the different types of blood vessels. And also mechanically in terms of what is going on with them. As fluid is being pushed through the arteries, it's actually being pushed by the beating of the heart. And that's pushing fluid through the arteries. The arteries are elastic. They have a thicker wall and a layer of smooth muscle around them that helps to propel the pulse down the arteries. So if you touch your wrist where the blood vessels are close to the surface, you can feel the pulse. And that is the movement of fluid that has been pushed by the heart. So it's moving through the artery in a wave-like motion. And you can feel it close to the surface there. You can feel it in the neck, feel it in the ankles. There are a few places in the body where you can feel the pulse. And that's always in an artery. So the fluid pressure is higher in the arteries, and there's a wave-like movement of fluid through the arteries. If an artery gets damaged, if it gets cut open, there will often be a spurting bleed where there's blood squirting out of it periodically each time the heart beats. Whereas if it's just a vein or just some tissue with some small blood vessels like capillaries in it, it will just sort of leak out. If it's from a large vein, it can be a very significant bleed, but it still won't be squirting like that. So when blood enters the veins, it's lost a lot of that pressure because it's been sort of filtered through the tissue. And so veins have little valves in them. They have little narrow places, sort of like bottlenecks, but they're made out of elastic connective tissue. So when the blood flows through it, it opens up a little bit and it can close if there's pressure against it, but it doesn't let the blood flow back that direction unless the valve collapses. And when it does, that causes the vein to get overinflated, and that's a varicose vein. So the valves in veins keep the fluid from flowing the right direction, keep it flowing the right direction, keep it from flowing backwards, unless they fail, and in which case you get a varicosity. So that typically happens in lower areas of the body where the blood would have to work against more gravity to get back up to the heart. Movement is also really important for helping the blood to flow through the veins to get back to where it's going. So yeah, so the veins do not have quite the same type of structure as the arteries have. They have thinner walls. They're not as much made for the high pressure, and then they have these valves that are sort of one-way passageways for the blood to flow through. And like I said, there are some large veins in the body, like the jugular vein or the vena cava, the disruption of which can be very serious, can lead to a lot of blood, but because they're lower pressure, most bleeding from veins is not as dramatic as it would be from a similar artery. So as people age, the tissue of both the veins and arteries tends to get thinner, just like the skin does. If you look at, a 90-year-old person's skin, it's very thin and papery. The same thing is going on to our blood vessels as we age. They start out very thin, but they can get thinner and more delicate and drier and more brittle as we age. So a lot of the time, people who are older are more prone to bruising. Sometimes they will get bruises that are not caused by any obvious injury, and sometimes they will get bruises that are very large and dark colored, where a lot of blood has escaped from the blood vessel into the interstitial tissue. Just the tissue outside of the blood vessels under the skin usually, and that can look like large dark bruises. So anytime you see a bruise is pretty much a broken blood vessel, but sometimes they happen in most of the time they happen as a result of a blunt force injury, but sometimes they happen for no apparent reason or at very little provocation. And this is true in old people. It's also true in people who are taking certain medicines that might make the blood less able to clot and more likely to escape from the blood vessels. And that would include blood thinners like warfarin. It would include some anti-inflammatories like aspirin, and it would also include some chemotherapy drugs. People are also more susceptible to bruising if they don't have adequate amounts of vitamin K, or if they don't have adequate supply of platelets in their blood. Platelets being a type of blood cell that helps with clotting. So in terms of types of blood cells, you've got basically 4 kinds that I really want you to know about and be aware of. Type number 1 is the red blood cell. They're kind of the standard blood cells. They carry oxygen. They are produced in the bone marrow. They don't make new copies of themselves. They don't have a nucleus, and they don't have the DNA that regular cells in your body have that allow them to split and make new copies of themselves. So they're kind of unusual as far as cells go in that regard. Everybody has lots of red blood cells in their blood. If you lose blood regularly, you can have less of them than you need to carry blood around. And so that is anemia, less of them than you need to carry oxygen around in your blood. And so that is anemia. And anemia is very common in people who have regular periods. It is not so common in people who don't. Usually if it's occurring in someone who doesn't, whether it's a man or an older woman or a child or whatever, then usually there's a loss of blood somewhere else, often in the digestive system. Sometimes it can be a sign of a more serious thing like cancer or an autoimmune disease, but a lot of the time it's a bleed inside the digestive system, like an ulcer. It's not necessarily as noticeable from the outside because, when somebody has a digestive bleed, they might have visible blood in their stool, but they often don't, especially if it's further up in their digestive system. So usually, if someone is having anemia that is not going away or that keeps reoccurring, it's because of loss of blood from somewhere. The usual straightforward way of getting rid of anemia is to eat foods that are rich in iron, which includes red meat, and it also includes green leafy vegetables. In my experience, people tend to do better if they're getting both of those things rather than just one or the other. So the second type of blood cell that I really want you to know about are platelets, which I already mentioned. Platelets are very small blood cells that help with the forming of blood clots. So platelets are vital to getting wounds to start healing. They're not the only factor that is involved in blood clot formation, but they are a big one. And there are some drugs and some herbs like ginkgo extract, for instance, that can interfere with platelets, interfere with a substance called platelet activating factor that gets platelets to start working. And that can make the blood people say thin. It's not really that it's thin, it's that it doesn't clot. So it's more prone to free bleeding. At the same time, if somebody's platelets are too active or they're clotting too much or there's too much of them, then that can cause blood clots, which can lead to blockages in the circulatory system, which can be very bad, especially if they get into the heart or the brain. They can cause a severe event. They can cause a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. So platelets necessary for being able to heal from injuries, but also potentially can be overactive and become dangerous to the circulatory system. The third one is macrophages, white blood cells. There's two large categories of white blood cells, one of which is macrophages. Macrophages are white blood cells that sort of surround and envelop pathogens. They sort of are like blobs that gobble up germs. So these are larger white blood cells that, especially in the early stages of an infection, will show up and start cleaning things up, and often will prevent any clinically significant infection from occurring. And when you see pus coming out of a wound, pus is usually made out of these macrophages that have been spent, that have gobbled up as many germs as they can, and then they've died themselves. And so you get like a sort of greenish stuff or yellowish stuff consisting of lots of dead white blood cells. But in a healthy person, they're just circulating with the blood, and as you invariably come in contact with bacteria and things like that, they can swallow some of them up. So these are sort of a first line defense against infection, a first line and very non-specific defense against infection. And then the final category that I want you to know about are lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are also called white blood cells because they are blood cells and they are white, but they're smaller than macrophages. There are a bunch of types of lymphocytes, but they respond to a lot of different inflammatory and infectious conditions. And help the body to fight off infection as well, often by binding to other cells and either killing them or signaling to macrophages and other things to come and kill them. So those are they're not only part of how you fight germs, they're part of how your body fights cancer cells and various other threats like that. And they can often be present even when there's just inflammation without infection. A lot of the time, if someone gets an infection, the macrophages will get used up first. They'll get produced and they'll get used up, and then the white blood cells will take it over from there. I mean, the lymphocytes will take it over from there. They're all white blood cells. So those are 4 general categories of blood cells that I want you to know about. And then I want you to know that the stuff that they're floating in is the plasma. Plasma by itself is sort of a straw-colored liquid. It's the liquid part of blood. It consists of salt and water and other minerals, and also lots of different proteins and hormones and things like that. So that is kind of an overview of what the tissue of blood looks like, and then the sort of general layout of the circulatory system with veins and arteries and capillaries. Just a moment. So as systems of the body goes, I would say that the circulatory system is a very dynamic one. There is a lot of physical movement happening within the circulatory system at any given time. And because of that fact, and the fact that its functions are so vital to life, it is a system that a lot of things can go wrong with, and that a lot of things tend to go wrong with. And so as an herbalist, whether you end up working professionally or just with a close group of people, you are very likely to see and be asked for help with conditions of the circulatory system. So here's some of the stuff that can go on with that and what you might do about it. So one of the most basic things, one of the most common things that happens is when someone's heart is pounding too hard or the tension in their blood vessels is too high. And we could describe either of those situations as being high blood pressure. They're actually kind of different situations, but they often go together. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's going on when someone has hypertension, or also known as high blood pressure. When you look at blood pressure, a lot of the time there will be a number, right, that's associated with someone's blood pressure. It's a measurement of their blood pressure, and it will have a small number over top of a bigger number, like 120 over 60, something like that. And what that 60 stands for is how much pressure, how much fluid pressure there is in the arteries in between heartbeats. In other words, when the heart is relaxed. And the 120 is how much pressure there is at the maximum when the heart is fully contracted. So because there's a pulse going on, the pressure varies. And one of those numbers is the highest that the pressure gets to, and the other is the lowest that the pressure is getting to as the heart is beating. So there's a couple different factors that that influence that. One of those is how hard the heart is beating, how tightly the muscle of the heart is contracting, and how hard it is pushing the fluid downstream through the arteries. And the other number is just how tight those arteries are and how much pressure there is because of the tightness of the arteries squeezing against the fluid that's within them. So that number is the bottom number, the tightness of the arteries themselves. And then the top number is that number plus how hard the heart's beating. If those two numbers are very close together, it means that the heart isn't beating very hard. If they're very far apart, it means the heart's beating really hard. If the bottom number is high, then that means that the tension in the blood vessels is really high, regardless of what the heart is doing. So when that's the case, it's actually harder to fix than how hard the heart's beating, because you know from having had a heart all these years that your heart can beat really hard and it can calm down and not beat so hard. And you know, that can change within the course of a few minutes or within an hour. You know, something happens and you get angry, your heart starts pounding, you calm down and it stops. So that's, you know, stuff that can change moment to moment, basically. The bottom number, the tension in the blood vessels, does not tend to change moment to moment. It tends to change more slowly over the course of hours, sometimes over the course of days, or sometimes it doesn't really change that much. So a couple of different factors influence that are really easily varied by people's habits. And those two things are fluid volume, which is how much fluid is in the blood vessels, and electrolytes. So if someone has too much sodium, their blood pressure gets high because sodium causes the muscular sheath around the arteries to contract, to be tight, to hold tension in those arteries, to hold pressure in the fluid in those arteries. The organ that's responsible for regulating how much sodium is in your bloodstream and is in your body is the kidney, or kidneys in most of us. So getting plenty of fluids so that the kidneys can flush out excessive sodium or other electrolytes as needed is really important. Well, sometimes the kidneys just aren't doing that. They're not releasing electrolytes even as water is flowing through them, which they should be, but you know, especially as we age, parts get less efficient, less effective at what they're trying to do, and sometimes that's a thing that happens. But much of the time, cutting down on salt and increasing fluid intake, increasing water intake specifically, can help to lower that bottom number, which will bring the top number down with it. Herbs that are calming and just kind of being calm in general often will bring down that top number. Being more physically fit, being more conditioned so that the heart muscle is stronger, so that it doesn't have to try as hard, is also really helpful. So physical exercise and calming things help with the top number, and fluids and cutting down on sodium helps with the bottom number, to make things as simple as possible. You know, that's kind of an ideal, not, it doesn't always go like that, but you know, often enough it does. Another thing that will sometimes go wrong with the heart is there being something unusual about the speed at which the heart is beating. So a lot of the time the heart will beat fast, especially. It's seldom a problem if it's beating slow, if it's beating at a normal rate anyway. But if it starts beating too fast, that can feel uncomfortable, and it can also put more wear and tear on your heart. So that is typically something we would want to do something about. Sometimes holding the breath and tensing up the abdominal muscles can, so if you take in a deep breath as deep a breath as you can, then your lungs have expanded around your heart. And then if you hold the breath and press up with your abdominal muscles, then you're sort of putting pressure on your heart from all sides, just kind of giving it a gentle squeeze. And that will sometimes, that is a very low cost and very immediate thing that will often get a fast heartbeat to slow down. And that's if the heartbeat is just caused by something like an irregularity in the way that your body's conducting electricity to your heart. Now, another reason why the heart might beat fast is if someone is low on fluid volume, if they're very dehydrated. That will actually make the heart beat fast because there's not enough fluid for the circulation to work very well. So the heart is trying to make up for that by beating faster. This will especially happen in a very dehydrated person when they stand up. And sometimes there's a sensation of faintness that goes along with that, sometimes not. So that is something that, taking in more fluids is helpful with. In some inflammatory conditions, you'll also get rapid heartbeat. So there are some herbs that are helpful for that, but it's more of an advanced type of situation. But fast heartbeat can also be treated by some calming herbs. And we'll talk some in a few minutes here about a couple of herbs that are good for that. But herbs that calm and strengthen the beating of the heart are useful in that situation. Hawthorn's one that we've talked about in the past that would fall into that category. And then another situation that's kind of related is when the heart is beating, maybe fast, maybe not fast, but without having the proper rhythm to it. So normally there is a 4-part rhythm to the heartbeat. Each chamber beats once and then it starts over again. People sometimes call this QRST. I mean, each of those letters standing for one of the chambers of the heart contracting. And people would sometimes describe the length from the first beat of that 4-part series to the last as being the QT interval. And that's just kind of like the length for a 4-part heartbeat to occur. So if you see that written in something about the heart, that's what they're talking about there. Hawthorn again would be something that you could use for helping to make the heartbeat more regular. And motherwort, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is another herb that could do this. And these are doing this by changing the way that electricity is conducted to the heart, and also by reducing inflammation and strengthening the musculature of the heart too, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. But yeah, getting a regular heartbeat to happen. If a heartbeat becomes irregular, a lot of the time resting helps it to get more regular rather than trying to do something physical. It's something that is often would be exacerbated by exercise. So that's something to be aware of with that. It sometimes is with just about any issue with the heart, where the heart isn't doing what it should be doing. Drinking water helps because the kidneys use that water to help balance the electrolytes in the body, to help get the right ratio of electrolytes happening in the bloodstream and in the tissue of the heart. Because when that's thrown off, and really, lack of water, lack of sufficient water is a major reason why that gets thrown off in the first place. And so it can be a really good, really safe first step to take as far as trying to get things back to normal. Of course, with the heart, you have to be careful with it because anything can become an emergency with the heart. If somebody's heart is beating incorrectly and it's not straightening out, then it might be Not a good do-it-yourself project to try and fix that. But, drinking some water, doing some simple exercises, taking some simple herbs can be helpful when it's not an emergency situation, when things are not so out of balance that the person's in danger, and when, especially if that's all you have access to, then it's really a lot better than nothing. And a lot of the time it is adequate. A lot of the time it takes care of things. Because the body, especially around the heart, has multiple systems in place to try and make sure that things don't go irreconcilably wrong, even though they inevitably do run into hitches, just like any system of the body. Just a second. So the first herb that I want to talk about today is motherwort. Motherwort is a member of the mint family. It grows to be about 5 or 6 feet tall. It has square stems, and it has pink flowers that occur at the leaf axils. So, in other words, at the places where the leaf stems join the main stem. And the places where these flowers attach are actually really prickly, which is not very common among mints. Most of the mints we use medicinally don't really have anything on them that's like spiky or prickly that will hurt you if you grab it. But motherwort usually does have very bristly, spiky bits where the flowers attach. So, if you do happen to pick it, which it's already flowered for this year, but if you do happen to pick it, that's something you want to watch out for. The whole above ground part of the plant is used, although the stem is pretty woody. So I'll often, pick the leaves and flowers off the stem and then leave the stem behind. The plant is bitter and cool tasting, but not really minty. It has lobed leaves. They're almost shaped like maple leaves or something like that, which is different from most other members of the mint family as well. The main thing that I use motherwort for is that it's very calming. So it has similar properties to skullcap, chamomile, or passion flower, in that it calms someone's nerves and help them to fall asleep. So most of the time, if I'm using motherwort, that's actually what I'm using it for. The Latin name of motherwort is Leonurus cardiaca. Leonurus means lion's ear, cardiaca means of the heart, because it is used for the heart. And it is in the lion's ear genus, which is the name of a different closely related plant that has a shape that I guess reminded people of a lion's ear, but probably they had never actually seen a lion. So that's the Latin name of that plant. And it is not a native species here in North America. It was brought over here as a medicinal crop, but it often occurs on its own. It's often a wild plant in fields, especially. Often you'll find it around the habitations of humans, but not real close. So because it is a tall weed, it doesn't tend to survive in lawns or anything like that, the way that clovers or something like that might. But it often does grow on old farms, waysides, and places like that. So like other mints, it can form very robust, somewhat aggressive, invasive stands where it is growing. So sometimes you can find a patch of motherwort and gather 10 pounds of herb from it and still leave plenty behind. So it often grows in large amounts when you do find it, even though it's not as common as some other ruderal mints like ground ivy or dead nettle. And it has a very thick woody stem. Even though it's not a tree or a bush or anything like that, it dies to the ground every winter, but it does have a stem that's probably a ½ inch on a side or so, and gets very woody as it dries out. So usually gather a decent sized amount of it every summer and dry it and make tincture out of it. And like I said, I often use it as a remedy for the nervous system. It calms the nerves, it produces sleep, it reduces anxiety, and it relaxes the muscles. So you could call it a muscle relaxer as well. In addition to all of that, it has some very mild effects on helping labor to progress, which is, I think, why it's called motherwort. It helps contractions at first to relax and then to become stronger, and theoretically more coordinated. And then, of course, like I mentioned, it is used for the heart. It's used to slow down the heartbeat and to make it more regular. And one of the group of substances that are in motherwort are these chemicals called cardiac glycosides. Cardiac glycosides, a cardiac glycoside is a steroid with a sugar molecule attached that has an effect on the heart. So like other steroidal compounds, they are anti-inflammatory. But unlike steroids in general, cardiac glycosides have an effect on the way that potassium is used within the nervous system and within the tissues of the muscles. So it's actually has the effect of changing how electricity is conducted in the heart muscle. And it does so in such a way that makes the beating slower and steadier and stronger. So if someone has a fluttering heartbeat, it's a great thing for that. It slows it down, it makes the individual beats stronger, and it makes them regular. So all of that makes it a really useful herb for the heart in general. It also relaxes the muscles and relaxes the blood vessels and relaxes the emotional tension that affects the heart. So it's doing a whole bunch of things that have the effect of it being really useful for a heart that might be fluttering, racing, beating out of rhythm, that sort of thing. Its mechanism of action is very similar to digitalis, but it is not poisonous. digitalis will slow your heartbeat all the way down to a full stop. Motherwort will not do that. It will slow it down to a point where you feel really drowsy, but it will not make it stop, or at least not ever in any case that we have documentation of, and we've been using this herb for a long time. There probably is some ridiculous dose at which it would become dangerous, but at common doses like 1 milliliter or 5 milliliters or even 15 milliliters, it doesn't do anything other than produce a lot of drowsiness. That's the worst of what it does. So motherwort is a good herb to know about. Like I said, it's kind of already come and gone for this year. It may not be wild where you live. It's kind of a hit or miss thing to be able to find it growing in the wild, because it is, like I said, not a native plant here. And also not especially successful as a weed, except in certain conditions like tall fields of weeds that you might find on a farm or something like that. The second plant that I want to talk about is called sumac. We actually have a few different varieties of sumac here in Kentucky. There's staghorn sumac, winged sumac, and fragrant sumac. Staghorn sumac is the main one that I use for medicine. There's also poison sumac, but that's pretty different, and it has white fruit instead of red fruit like the other ones, so there's no mistaking it. And you can live your whole life in Kentucky and never come across it. So it does grow here, but only in certain swamp-like conditions that people don't tend to go in much anyway. And so it's pretty easy to avoid. A lot of people see the sumac with red berries and think that that's poison sumac. Oh, sorry. A lot of people see the red berried sumac and think that that is poison sumac because they don't know that there's any other kind. Sumac is used as a food ingredient in traditional foods here in Kentucky, as well as in traditional foods in the Middle East. And the way that sumac works is, I sometimes describe the fruit on it as being a berry, but it's not really a berry. It's like a little nutlet. It's a little seed that's covered in a velvety red substance. And that velvety red stuff is extremely sour and a little bit sweet. And that is the part that's actually used. And you can put it in a sieve or something like that and roll it around, and the red, dusty velvet stuff will come off of it and leave the seed behind. And it can be used for dyeing, it can be used for tanning leather, it can be used for flavoring food. It has a sour, tangy flavor to it. And of course, it can be used as medicine as well. Oh, just a moment. So medicinally, if you take a little bit of sumac and you put it in your mouth, it makes your mouth water. If you swallow it, it makes your stomach produce more stomach juices. It makes your whole digestive system produce probably more digestive juices. So it's actually a sour, it's not an antacid, it's sort of like a pro-acid, but it helps promote digestion. It helps with indigestion. And it does it without shutting down your body's natural ability to break down and absorb nutrients. So that's really helpful. But the main thing that I use it for is that it has a diuretic effect. Once it gets into your bloodstream, those same acids that make it sour get processed out by your kidneys. And then those acids are in your kidneys, and your kidneys pour through a bunch of water to wash them away. And in the process of doing that, it makes you pee a lot more. And if there are stones forming inside the kidneys. It will help to dissolve them because of its acidity, and it will also help to get them expelled by having more fluid flow through. So has a variety of good effects on the kidneys that mostly come down to it helping to move a lot of fluid through the kidneys. I want to show you the extract of it. It has a very pink color to it. When I was a kid, we'd go and gather these berries and make pink lemonade out of them. It was just basically like a tea made out of those berries and then allowed to chill. And it's sweet and it's sour like lemonade, but it has pink color to it. So a couple weekends, 2 weekends ago, when I made a big summer wild food meal, I made a big jug of that as well. It's a traditional summertime beverage in Kentucky, in Eastern Kentucky especially. So sumac is one of my main herbs that I use for the urinary tract because it helps to flush things out, and it changes the pH of the urine, which will often help to get rid of bacteria that have taken up residence. Sometimes what you get with urinary tract infections is you'll get bacteria in the bladder that are changing the pH of the bladder so that it is more like the large intestine, and so that more large intestine type bacteria can come and live there. And sumac helps to reverse that process by making things more acidic, which sounds like it would be bad. And it probably would be bad if it went on long enough, but just as a short-term thing, really helps to get rid of bacterial load and helps to clean things out. In the process of doing so, because it's activating the kidneys and because it's getting more fluid to flow through, it can also help with the electrolyte balancing that I talked about earlier. It can help to reduce blood pressure by, well, for one thing, it's taking fluid out of the system. So if there's too much fluid in the system, that can lead to higher pressure. So in that sense, it's kind of like letting some of the air out of a balloon so that the skin of the balloon isn't as tight, but it's doing that with the circulatory system. And then at the same time, because it's helping that fluid to process through the kidneys, it's helping to get rid of excess sodium or excess whatever minerals might be there in excess. And it's not necessarily going to force those minerals out, but it's going to give the kidneys an option to remove them because of the water that's flowing through them. So sumac is, I often use it along with other herbs, but if I'm doing something where I'm trying to get the kidneys to act differently, it often plays a role in that situation. So one thing that I might do with sumac and motherwort is to combine them together if someone's blood pressure were consistently high, because then you're doing something that is calming and something that is diuretic together. And that's a good combination for helping the body to regulate blood pressure, because the calming something is helping to relax those blood vessels. And of course, in this case, helping the heart to beat in a strong and regular way. And then the something that is activating the kidneys is helping to get rid of excess minerals, excess electrolytes, sodium, and things like that, as well as helping to regulate whatever amount of fluid needs to be in the circulatory system. So those two things together, sumac and motherwort, can be really helpful. And those two strategies together of using something calming as well as using something diuretic can often be helpful, even if you don't happen to have those two particular herbs. So it's a good good approach to know about. All right. Any questions about either of those herbs or about the circulatory system in general? I'm running a little bit shorter today than usual, but I did want to say that probably in later September or early October, we'll be doing the next round of herb walk. And I'd like to everybody to come if you can manage to. We're going to be back at Heisel Farm Park and looking at what is happening there as autumn is coming on. I think that it would be a really good opportunity to get to see some different plants and to get some firsthand experience with some of them. Also, if you've been going back and trying to watch the videos from past classes, you may have noticed that something had gone wrong with them. I'm working on getting that fixed, but a bunch of them apparently didn't upload when I thought they had and were not available for people to see. So I spent a couple hours last night trying to get that all straightened out. And hopefully in the next, I'll try and get tonight's video up tonight. And if there are any missing, I'll try and sort that out. But I had a problem with the Zoom hosting where things were not getting saved and not getting uploaded, not getting shared. So I am working on getting that situation fixed. All right, so well, let's see, what do we have here? Do you know what the dates are for the weekend intensive at the end? Let's see. I do not know. I know that it will probably be the last weekend in April. I don't know. Let me see if I can look at the dates for that. No, here. Okay, so that would be the 27th and 28th of April. Will be the dates for the weekend intensive, and we'll do 2 days where we have workshops here at the clinic or via Zoom, and then also some herb walks on those days to some places to look at some different plants. And I recommend for everybody that can to be there in person, because there's some things that are just a little more hands-on by their nature, like using the microscope or like cupping. But if you're not able to, if you're too far away, then it will be live streamed as well. Those dates are the 27th and 28th of April, 2024. All right. So yeah, so that's a general overview of the circulatory system and a couple of herbs that are useful for using along with it. And hope that helps to shed some light on that. And we will be referring back to those actions as we talk about some other systems as well, because the circulatory system feeds every other system in the body. And for example, if we're talking about the brain, it's hard to talk about it without talking about the blood supply and the oxygenation of the brain, which comes through the circulatory system. So it's a short class today, but but we will touch back on these concepts some more as we move forward. All right. Any other questions before we go? All right. Well, thank you all so much, and I will talk to you again next Tuesday.